way back in the mid-2000s when Gnarls Barkley had just debuted. We got our first Borat movie. George W. Bush was the worst president we had ever known. Back then, science communicators had some very tiring fights amongst ourselves. Specifically, the big thing was fighting about a thing called framing, which was popularized by people like Chris Mooney and Matt Nisbet as a sort of rebuke against those who were, for instance, fighting against creationism by sharing pictures of Jesus riding a velociraptor, or snuggling a velociraptor, or being a velociraptor. Look, I don't know. Velociraptors were very funny to us back then. Mooney et al. Argued that the average person would not respond well to mockery of their fervently held beliefs, and that if we wanted to actually change people's minds, then we had to understand their psychology and develop a science-based plan to convince them to accept science into their hearts. Not only did they argue that outright mockery should be off the table, but they also argued that scientists could not win people over with simple, unemotional facts. Someone who insists that the Earth is flat, for instance, isn't going to be won over by logic because they didn't logic their way into that belief in the first place. Writing in Science in 2007, Mooney and Nisbet argued that scientists must realize that facts will be repeatedly misapplied and twisted in direct proportion to their relevance to the political debate and decision-making. In short, as unnatural as it might feel, in many cases, scientists should strategically avoid emphasizing the technical details of science when trying to defend it. You might hear that and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Where's the disagreement here? But let me tell you, it was this whole thing. Ironically, scientists and science communicators didn't appreciate being told that their methods were straight up wrong or even damaging and that they need to change. Like, even if those were facts, which they aren't, it's just merely one way of looking at the sociological data. Weirdly, the framing proponents were only proving themselves right by trying to change people's behavior with facts instead of, framing it in a more palatable way. Like, hey, we're not going to make you burn your Raptor Jesus painting, but maybe don't have it in the background of your YouTube videos, because then Christians won't immediately turn off your channel and never come back. Okay, so all of that was 15 years ago. Why am I thinking of it now? Well, it popped into my head because of a recent New York Times piece by Farhad Manjoo, who I have hung out with in the past, and I liked him, and I consider him, a Twitter friend. But wow, did they fuck up. Manjoo wrote an article about their family's bubble, including their partner and their 2 children who are both in learning pods and various activities. And they were doing this in anticipation of deciding whether or not they should travel hundreds of miles to see their parents for Thanksgiving. It's honestly a great article at first because Manjoo manages to talk to a bunch of people in their bubble and in their kids' bubbles, and they find out exactly how far those bubbles extend. And it's all illustrated really nicely. They're easy to follow color coordinations, the whole deal. And it seems to be building up to a great conclusion. Manjoo writes, once I had counted everyone, I realized that visiting my parents for Thanksgiving would be like asking them to sit down to dinner with more than 100 people. And considering that their parents are elderly and have several health complications, that's an easy decision. But wait, not so fast. Manjoo writes, shame me if you must, but my wife and I decided that we would travel for Thanksgiving, though with a few added measures for safety. I'm sorry, what? We're pulling our kids out of the learning pod for a week before we leave. Okay, well, it should really be like 2 weeks, the length that you would be expected to quarantine before visiting elderly parents to make sure that you're not infected, but okay. We're driving to my parents' house, not flying. Okay, that's great, but it is hundreds of miles. Are you considering stopping along the way? And have you thought about how this is the biggest travel week every year in America, so the roads might be bad? And considering how common car accidents are, what if there are accidents? What if you're in an accident during a time when medical personnel are already at this moment completely overwhelmed and taking triple shifts and moving COVID patients into children's hospitals just to find beds? What if you have to go to the hospital? We're looking into getting tested before we go and probably after we return. I'm sorry, looking into probably after we return? What the actual fuck? If you ask me if I'm free to help you move apartments next month, I might say I'm looking into my schedule for that day and probably could help, which clearly would mean fuck no, I'm not doing that. Hire movers. It's Weasley language. And here's where I started thinking about framing, because honestly, millions of Americans are making these same calculations. How many people are in my bubble and the bubble of the people I want to hang out with? What precautions are we all taking? What's the risk? How much do I really, really, really want to do it despite whatever the risk is? And it's understandable that many of those people are going to choose poorly. They're going to travel, they're going to see their relatives, and the pandemic is going to get worse. Do I blame them? Absolutely. Yes, I do. But more so, I blame the complete lack of governmental leadership that has forced all of these lay people to make very complicated risk calculations. Our government could have said, you must wear masks, you cannot travel, you cannot leave your household until this is over. But they didn't, which is one reason why we are on month 8 of this disaster and people are now fed up. They're tired and they're willing to make a terrible decision. So while I do blame the individuals who are making these terrible decisions, I'm not going to call them out individually and shame them here. In fact, that might be bad framing. That might encourage those same people to go out and do even riskier things, while the systemic problems that led to all of this happening in the first place will still remain. But while I'm not going to call out the average individual, I am going to call out Manju because, for fuck's sake, they're a science communicator writing in a newspaper with a circulation of about 500,000 people. Their article has a lot of great facts in it, but because the framing is so god-awful, people are going to read it and they're going to come away thinking, oh, I can travel too. Because what more obvious, unassailable fact is there in this pandemic than, for instance, more than 250,000 Americans are dead who shouldn't be dead? And if you just stay inside, no one else has to die. Those are facts. But as Manju themselves makes clear, oh, the irony, facts pale in comparison to the simple statement, but I don't want to. And the more people think that I don't want to is an acceptable response, the more people who are going to die. After a brutally quick and healthy backlash online, the New York Times did quietly edit Manju's piece to add a few details. Like now they say that, oh, they're going to have Thanksgiving dinner outside in November with no notice and no mention of logistics like separate tables or heaters. And they also say that they will not be staying at their parents' place overnight. But they do still say that they'll probably think about getting tested. And they point out that they will be unable to stop the grandparents from hugging the grandkids. But they can stop it. They just don't want to. So more people are going to die.